The war room buzzed with quiet confidence as holographic displays showed the final targets of the Great Cleansing. 12 small worlds remained unconquered in a galaxy that had learned to fear the purple banners of the Kaleth Empire. Admiral Thane studied the tactical data with the satisfaction of a hunter who had cornered his prey. 300 star systems already flew the Imperial flag, their populations either dead or working in the labor camps that powered the Empire's endless expansion. The largest of these final holdouts sat in an unremarkable corner of space, orbiting a yellow star that the locals called Sol. Intelligence reports painted a picture of primitive beings who had barely mastered interplanetary travel. They called themselves humans, and their world showed all the signs of a fractured civilization still fighting among themselves even as the Empire approached their doorstep. Thane moved through the massive command center of his flagship, the Eternal Domination, watching his officers prepare for what military analysts had already declared the easiest campaign of the war. The humans possessed no energy shields, no plasma weaponry, and no unified planetary defense force. Their most advanced spacecraft still relied on chemical propulsion and crude nuclear reactors. By Imperial standards, they were using technology that belonged in a museum. General Voss joined him at the central display, his scarred face showing the confidence of a warrior who had never tasted defeat. Together they had conquered the crystal cities of Altair, broken the hive minds of the Outer Rim, and reduced the proud warrior clans of Beta Centauri to scattered refugees. This final campaign would add another easy victory to their collection. Before the Empire could claim dominion over the entire galaxy, the fleet stretched across space like a dark ocean of metal and death. 200 dreadnoughts formed the main battle line, each one capable of reducing a continent to ash with its primary weapons. 5,000 support vessels carried the ground forces, supply lines, and specialized equipment needed to process a conquered world. The combined firepower could shatter planets, and their shields could deflect anything these primitive humans might throw at them. Intelligence briefings had revealed almost everything about human society, and none of it impressed the Imperial Command Staff. The beings were divided into hundreds of separate nations that spent more time fighting each other than preparing for external threats. Their military forces used projectile weapons that fired chunks of metal, supported by crude explosives that released energy through uncontrolled chemical reactions. Most laughably, they still used organic soldiers instead of the genetically enhanced warriors that had made the Empire unstoppable. Voss pointed to readouts showing human military deployments around their major population centers. The defensive positions looked pathetic compared to the fortress worlds the Empire had cracked open like eggs. These humans had built their cities in the open, with no energy barriers or underground command bunkers. Their orbital defenses consisted of a handful of space stations that wouldn't last 5 minutes against Imperial firepower. The approaching fleet had already detected frantic communications between human governments as their primitive sensors registered the massive armada entering their solar system. Long-range interceptors translated desperate messages between world leaders, military commanders, and civilian populations as the reality of invasion became undeniable. Some humans seemed to be trying to coordinate a defense, while others appeared to be preparing for evacuation or surrender. Thane almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The Empire had learned long ago that mercy was a luxury that conquered species couldn't afford. Every world that submitted peacefully became a productive part of Imperial civilization, while those that resisted were ground down until nothing remained but examples for future conquests. The choice was always the same, and the outcome was always inevitable. The tactical computers had already calculated the optimal approach vectors, target priorities, and resource allocation for maximum efficiency. Phase 1 would eliminate human orbital defenses and military installations. Phase 2 would involve landing forces at strategic locations to secure major population centers. Phase 3 would begin the processing of survivors and the establishment. of Imperial administration. The entire operation was expected to take less than one local week. As the fleet moved deeper into the system, passing the orbits of the outer planets, sensors began picking up signs of human military activity. Their crewed spacecraft were moving into defensive formations around their homeworld, while ground-based installations were powering up what appeared to be missile systems and radar arrays. The humans were going to fight, which would make the conquest slightly more interesting but no less certain. Voss laughed as he watched human warships taking positions near their moon. The largest of their vessels was smaller than an Imperial escort frigate, and their weapons appeared to be simple kinetic projectiles and nuclear warheads. Against energy shields that could deflect stellar radiation, such primitive armaments were completely useless. The humans might as well be throwing rocks at a mountain. The communication arrays crackled with intercepted human transmissions as their leaders made final preparations for a hopeless battle. Military commanders were issuing orders to units across the planet, while civilian authorities were implementing evacuation procedures for their major cities. Some transmissions spoke of resistance movements and guerrilla warfare, but the Empire had dealt with such tactics countless times before. Primitive insurgencies always collapsed once their technological and numerical disadvantages became apparent. Final approach vectors were locked in as the Imperial fleet reached the edge of human weapons range. The first shots would be fired within hours, beginning the last chapter of human independence. Victory protocols were already being transmitted to ground forces, and the labor camp administrators were preparing to receive a new workforce estimated at several 100 million beings. Admiral Thane settled into his command chair as the vast fleet moved into attack formation. Around him, officers and technicians made final preparations for a battle that would be remembered only as a footnote in the histories of Imperial expansion. The humans had achieved faster-than-light travel and built a modest interplanetary civilization, which was more than many species managed before their encounter with the Empire. They deserved to be conquered by the best. As the range closed and weapons systems powered up across 200 dreadnoughts, no one in the Imperial command structure suspected they were about to encounter something unprecedented in galactic warfare. The humans were about to teach the Empire what happened when an unstoppable force met a species that refused to be moved. Plasma fire lit up the darkness of space as the first Imperial volleys tore through human defensive positions. Commander Roth watched from the bridge of his destroyer as enemy installations around the third planet vanished in brilliant explosions. The primitive orbital platforms offered no resistance to weapons that could melt asteroids, and their crude missile systems barely registered on Imperial sensors before being vaporized. Everything proceeded exactly according to plan for the first 30 minutes of battle. Human spacecraft advanced in predictable formations, firing their chemical rockets and nuclear warheads in desperate salvos that splashed harmlessly against energy shields designed to withstand solar flares. Imperial gunners picked off the attacking vessels with casual precision, each shot obliterating targets that had taken these primitives decades to build. Then something impossible happened. Instead of retreating when their weapons proved useless, the human ships accelerated directly toward the Imperial fleet. Roth stared at his tactical display in confusion as dozens of crippled vessels, their hulls breached and atmosphere venting into space, continued their attack runs even as they died around their crews. One human cruiser, its forward section completely destroyed by plasma fire, somehow maintained course and slammed into the side of an Imperial heavy destroyer. The collision sent shock waves through both fleets. Kinetic energy that no energy shield was designed to handle tore through armor plating and internal systems, crippling the destroyer and sending debris spinning into nearby vessels. The human ship disintegrated on impact, but its sacrifice had accomplished what their weapons could not: real damage to an Imperial warship. Across the battle space, more human vessels began copying the same insane tactic. Ships that should have been retreating or surrendering instead turned themselves into guided missiles, ramming Imperial vessels with reckless abandon. Each collision traded a human crew for critical damage to ships that had taken the Empire years to construct. The mathematical exchange rate favored the humans, despite their technological disadvantage. General Voss received his first ground combat reports as Imperial landing craft descended through the atmosphere toward major human population centers. The initial deployments had gone smoothly, with drop pods delivering enhanced warriors to strategic locations across multiple continents. Then the real fighting began, and nothing in Imperial military doctrine had prepared the ground forces for what they encountered. In the ruins of what humans called London, a single squad of enhanced warriors found themselves pinned down by enemy fire from multiple directions. These weren't the panicked civilians or hastily assembled militias that intelligence reports had predicted. Human soldiers moved through the urban landscape with practiced efficiency, using their knowledge of local terrain to set up ambushes and killing zones that neutralized Imperial technological advantages. The enhanced warriors were genetically superior to any natural being, capable of lifting heavy weapons with one hand and surviving injuries that would kill normal creatures. But superiority meant nothing when the enemy refused to fight fair. Human soldiers used explosives to collapse buildings, flooding, and chemical. Weapons that bypassed personal shields. They fought from hidden positions, struck without warning, and disappeared into underground tunnels before Imperial forces could respond. In what had once been New York, Captain Torres witnessed something that would haunt his dreams for years afterward. A human soldier, bleeding from multiple plasma wounds and barely able to walk, approached an Imperial checkpoint while carrying what sensors identified as a thermonuclear device. The human made no attempt to hide his intentions or negotiate surrender. He simply walked forward until he was close enough to eliminate both himself and an entire squad of enhanced warriors in a blinding flash of atomic fire. The reports flooding into Imperial command centers painted a picture of warfare unlike anything in their extensive military experience. These humans didn't fight to win in any traditional sense. They fought to extract the maximum possible cost from their enemies, trading their lives for Imperial casualties with cold mathematical precision. Every position was defended to the last soldier, and every retreat was accompanied by booby traps and delayed explosives. Human civilian populations proved equally troublesome. Instead of fleeing from Imperial forces or cooperating with occupation authorities, they actively supported military resistance efforts. Children served as scouts and message carriers. Elderly humans provided intelligence about Imperial movements, and civilian infrastructure was systematically sabotaged to deny its use to occupation forces. Roth found himself studying after action. Reports that described human behavior patterns completely outside Imperial understanding. When cornered, most species would surrender or negotiate. Humans escalated. When outgunned, most species would retreat. Humans adapted their tactics to turn disadvantages into weapons. When facing inevitable defeat, most species would submit. Humans seemed to view death as just another tactical option. The most disturbing aspect of human resistance was their apparent lack of concern for collateral damage to their own people and infrastructure. Imperial doctrine assumed that conquered species would want to preserve their cities, cultural sites, and civilian populations. Humans demonstrated no such attachment, willingly destroying their own assets if doing so inflicted greater damage on Imperial forces. By the end of the first day, Imperial forces controlled most of the strategic objectives they had been assigned to capture. Military installations, government buildings, transportation hubs, and communication centers were under Imperial control. By traditional measures, the invasion was succeeding ahead of schedule. But the casualty reports told a different story entirely. The Empire had lost more soldiers and equipment in 24 hours of fighting on this single world than in their previous 5 conquest campaigns combined. Worse, The humans showed no signs of conventional surrender or collapse. If anything, resistance was intensifying as surviving human forces adapted their tactics to Imperial capabilities and began coordinating increasingly sophisticated attacks against occupation forces. Admiral Thane called an emergency strategy conference as reports continued to pour in from ground commanders requesting additional reinforcements, medical support, and specialized equipment to deal with threats they had never encountered before. The humans were treating the entire planet as a weapon, using everything from weather patterns to urban planning to create tactical advantages that their primitive technology shouldn't have been able to provide. Intelligence officers struggled to understand human decision-making processes that seemed to operate by completely different rules than any known species. These beings were willing to sacrifice entire cities to deny the Empire strategic advantages. They used their own casualties as psychological warfare, broadcasting images of destruction to rally resistance movements in other regions. Most incomprehensibly, they seemed to view their hopeless situation as motivation to fight harder rather than reason to surrender. Supply convoys disappeared into the human countryside like ships swallowed by fog. Colonel Beck stared at the tactical map showing his battalion's area of control, watching red markers indicate the locations of destroyed vehicles, missing patrols, and sabotaged infrastructure. 3 weeks into the occupation, Imperial forces held the major cities but controlled almost nothing beyond their fortified perimeters. The humans had turned their entire world into a maze of traps and ambushes. Every road could hide an explosive device, every building might contain snipers, and every civilian could be carrying intelligence to enemy forces. Imperial patrols that ventured beyond secured zones faced constant harassment from attackers who struck without warning and vanished before retaliation was possible. In the mountains that humans called the Himalayas, Imperial forces discovered that their enemy had been preparing for this kind of warfare for generations. Hidden bunker complexes carved into solid rock contained stockpiles of weapons, food, and equipment that could sustain resistance operations for years. The humans had built an entire military infrastructure designed specifically for fighting a technologically superior enemy. Beck's intelligence officers brought him captured human documents that revealed the true scope of what they were facing. These weren't hastily organized militias or desperate civilians fighting for survival. Human military doctrine included detailed plans for exactly this scenario, occupation by a superior enemy force. They had studied their own history, learning from centuries of conflicts between different human nations, and developed strategies specifically designed to defeat invaders who possessed overwhelming technological advantages. The humans called it asymmetric warfare, and they had refined it into an art form. They didn't try to match Imperial forces in direct combat, where their technological disadvantages would be decisive. Instead, they forced Imperial troops to fight on human terms, using tactics that neutralized superior equipment and training, while maximizing the advantages of local knowledge and popular support. Imperial communication networks faced constant disruption from human cyber warfare specialists who had learned to infiltrate and subvert alien computer systems. Despite using completely different technological standards, human programmers somehow managed to introduce viruses and logic bombs into Imperial databases, corrupting intelligence reports and disrupting command communications at critical moments. General Voss received reports from across the occupied territories that painted a picture of systematic resistance that went far beyond simple military opposition. Human economic warfare targeted Imperial supply chains by sabotaging transportation networks, power grids, and manufacturing facilities. They didn't just destroy Imperial assets, they made it impossible for occupation forces to utilize local resources or establish stable administrative control. The humans had weaponized concepts that Imperial military strategists had never considered relevant to warfare. They used propaganda broadcasts to maintain morale among resistance fighters while spreading demoralizing messages to Imperial troops. They employed psychological warfare techniques that turned Imperial advantages into disadvantages, making occupation forces paranoid and trigger-happy in ways that drove more civilians to join resistance movements. Most disturbing was human use of their own casualties as tactical weapons. Instead of hiding their dead or minimizing damage reports, human resistance leaders broadcast graphic images of Imperial attacks on civilian targets to media networks across the galaxy. These transmissions reached other conquered worlds, sparking unrest and rebellion in star systems that had been pacified for decades. Intelligence analysis of captured human communications revealed something that shocked Imperial command staff to their core. These beings considered their losses acceptable as long as they inflicted proportional damage on Imperial forces. Human military planning included detailed calculations about acceptable casualty rates, optimal resource expenditure ratios, and strategic objectives that prioritized long-term resistance capability over short-term survival. In underground laboratories hidden beneath destroyed cities, human scientists worked with salvaged Imperial technology to develop new weapons specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in Empire equipment. They didn't try to replicate Imperial weapons. Instead, they created devices that could penetrate energy shields, jam communications networks, and neutralize genetic enhancements using principles that Imperial engineers had never anticipated. The most successful human innovations combined their primitive chemical knowledge with captured Imperial biotechnology. They developed biological weapons tailored specifically to attack the genetic modifications that made Imperial warriors superior to natural beings. For the first time in Imperial military history, enhanced soldiers began falling to weapons they couldn't defend against or even detect until symptoms appeared. Colonel Beck found himself fighting an enemy that learned from every engagement and adapted faster than Imperial forces could adjust their tactics. Human resistance cells shared information through communication networks that Imperial technicians couldn't decode or intercept. Each successful Imperial operation was studied, analyzed, and countered by human strategists who seemed to treat warfare as an intellectual puzzle to be solved rather than a contest to be won. The humans demonstrated another uniquely dangerous capability when their deep space communication systems made contact with other species throughout Imperial territory. Somehow, using technology that should have been centuries away from achieving interstellar communication, human resistance networks began coordinating with rebellion movements on distant worlds. Imperial garrison forces on planets that had been conquered decades ago suddenly faced uprisings using tactics identical to those employed on the human homeworld. Species that had been completely pacified were suddenly employing hit-and-run attacks, asymmetric warfare techniques, and the uniquely human concept of acceptable losses in pursuit of long-term strategic objectives. Intelligence reports from across Imperial space described resistance movements that had learned to fight using human methods. Local populations were being taught human tactical doctrines, supplied with human-designed weapons, and organized using human command structures that emphasized decentralized operation and individual initiative over traditional military hierarchy. Fatui, Empire found itself facing not just a human rebellion, but a galaxy-wide revolution powered by human strategic thinking and fueled by human determination to resist occupation at any cost. Species that had never possessed military traditions were suddenly fielding effective guerrilla forces trained by human advisors who had somehow managed to establish communication networks spanning hundreds of light years. General Voss realized that the humans had accomplished something no previous enemy had ever achieved. They had turned the Empire's vast size and diverse population from an advantage into a vulnerability. Every occupied world was now a potential source of rebellion, and every successful human tactic could be copied and employed by any species with the will to resist. Underground laboratories hummed with dangerous activity as human scientists worked with equipment they barely understood. Dr. Phillips wiped sweat from his forehead while adjusting delicate settings on a captured Imperial plasma generator. Around him, teams of engineers and technicians struggled to reverse engineer technology that represented centuries of alien development compressed into desperate months of trial and error. The breakthrough came when human ingenuity met imperial overconfidence. The Empire had never bothered to develop serious security protocols for their equipment because no conquered species had ever possessed the scientific knowledge to understand how Imperial technology functioned. Humans approached the problem differently, treating alien technology as puzzles to be solved rather than mysteries to be feared. Phillips and his team didn't try to copy Imperial designs exactly. Instead, they studied the underlying principles and developed their own applications using manufacturing techniques and materials available in human industrial facilities. The results were crude but effective. Plasma weapons built from salvaged Imperial components and human electronics that could penetrate energy shields designed to stop more sophisticated attacks. The first human plasma rifles appeared on battlefields 6 months after the invasion began. Imperial forces found themselves facing weapons that should have been impossible for primitives to develop, firing energy beams that carved through enhanced armor and disabled Imperial vehicles. The psychological impact was enormous. The invincible Empire was being fought with its own technology. More dangerous innovations followed as human creativity combined with desperate necessity. Imperial biotechnology fell into human hands when resistance fighters overran isolated research facilities, providing samples of the genetic modifications that made Imperial warriors superior to natural beings. Human biologists studied these enhancements not to replicate them, but to develop countermeasures. The biological weapons that resulted were precisely targeted to attack the genetic modifications that gave Imperial soldiers their advantages. Enhanced warriors who had been immune to conventional human weapons suddenly found themselves vulnerable to viruses and toxins specifically designed to exploit their artificial genetic improvements. The Empire's greatest military asset became a fatal weakness. Communications networks across Imperial space crackled with increasingly desperate reports from garrison commanders facing coordinated uprisings. The humans had accomplished something that military strategists considered theoretically impossible. They had established real-time communication with resistance movements on hundreds of worlds, using techniques that bypassed Imperial monitoring systems entirely. Admiral Thane studied intelligence reports that painted a picture of systematic rebellion spreading across the Empire like a plague. Species that had been conquered decades ago were suddenly employing tactical doctrines identical to those used by human resistance forces. Local populations were receiving training, equipment, and coordination from advisors who somehow managed to travel between star systems despite Imperial control of all major transportation networks. The key to human success lay in their understanding of franchise warfare, teaching other species to fight using human methods rather than trying to coordinate resistance from a central command structure. Human military advisors worked with local populations to develop tactics suited to each species' unique capabilities and environmental conditions, creating a diversity of resistance movements that shared common strategic objectives while remaining individually unpredictable. On the crystal world of Vega 7, insectoid beings who had been pacified for 50 years suddenly began employing swarm tactics that overwhelmed Imperial defenses through sheer coordination and numerical superiority. Human advisors had taught them to use their natural hive mind capabilities as a military advantage, turning biological traits that the Empire had dismissed as primitive into sophisticated tactical tools. In the gas giant systems of the Outer Rim, aquatic species learned to use their three-dimensional mobility in ways that Imperial forces couldn't counter. Human strategic thinking combined with alien physiology produced underwater guerrilla warfare techniques that made occupation impossible in any environment containing large bodies of water. General Voss received reports from military commanders across Imperial territory describing similar patterns. Local populations were being taught to weaponize their unique characteristics using human tactical principles adapted to alien biology and environmental conditions. The result was a proliferation of resistance movements that shared human strategic thinking while remaining completely unpredictable in their specific methods. The most shocking development came when human deep space probes made contact with the Empire's traditional enemies, species that had been fighting imperial expansion for decades along contested border regions. Within months, these natural enemies were coordinating with human strategists, sharing intelligence, and planning combined operations using human tactical doctrines. The Keth Confederation, which had resisted imperial expansion for centuries using conventional military strategies, suddenly began employing asymmetric warfare techniques that made their border worlds impossible to conquer. Human advisors had taught them to turn their technological disadvantages into tactical advantages, creating a military alliance that threatened the Empire's ability to maintain its outer territories. Imperial military logistics faced systematic disruption as coordinated attacks targeted supply convoys, communication networks, and transportation hubs across hundreds of star systems. The Empire's vast size, which had always been its greatest strategic advantage, became a critical vulnerability as rebellions erupted faster than Imperial forces could suppress them. Economic warfare spread as human-trained resistance movements learned to attack Imperial infrastructure using techniques that maximize damage while minimizing direct military confrontation. Power grids failed, manufacturing facilities exploded, and administrative centers faced constant sabotage from populations that had learned to treat occupation as an engineering problem to be solved rather than a political reality to be accepted. The Imperial Council received intelligence reports that painted a picture of coordinated rebellion that spanned the entire galaxy. Human influence had spread far beyond their home system, creating a network of resistance movements that shared tactical knowledge, strategic objectives, and the uniquely human willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of long-term freedom. Most disturbing was the discovery that humans had made contact with species beyond Imperial territory, civilizations that had never encountered the Empire but were now being prepared for eventual invasion using human military doctrines and tactical knowledge. The galaxy was being systematically organized for resistance against Imperial expansion by beings who had never possessed interstellar travel capabilities before their homeworld was invaded. Admiral Thane realized that the Empire faced something unprecedented in galactic history. They weren't fighting a rebellion. They were fighting a revolution that had learned to spread faster than Imperial forces could contain it, adapt quicker than Imperial strategies could counter it, and inspire populations that had never possessed military traditions to fight with effectiveness that rivaled the Empire's most elite forces. The humans had transformed the nature of galactic warfare itself, teaching every species in the galaxy that technological superiority could be overcome by strategic thinking, popular determination, and the willingness to pay any price for freedom. The invincible Empire suddenly faced the possibility that had never existed before in their history: total defeat by enemies they had created through their own success. The Imperial Council chambers fell silent as Admiral Thane finished his report. Around the curved walls of the ancient meeting hall, holographic displays showed the stark mathematics of a war that had consumed the Empire's future. 40% of the fleet destroyed or crippled. Economic systems disrupted across hundreds of worlds. Rebellions spreading faster than Imperial forces could suppress it. The cost of victory had become indistinguishable from the price of defeat. Chancellor Drax studied the tactical summaries with the expression of a leader who had watched the impossible become inevitable. 3 years of warfare against a single, primitive world had crippled an empire that had dominated the galaxy for centuries. The humans had been defeated in every traditional sense, their military shattered, their government scattered, their homeworld reduced to smoking ruins inhabited by scattered survivors hiding in underground shelters, yet somehow, impossibly, the humans had won. The mathematics were undeniable. Complete elimination of human resistance would require military resources that the Empire no longer possessed. Every surviving human represented a potential source of rebellion that could inspire uprisings across Imperial territory. The cost of maintaining permanent occupation forces on hundreds of worlds facing human-inspired resistance movements would bankrupt the Imperial treasury within a generation. General Voss presented the final casualty reports from the Sol system as imperial. Evacuation began. Human losses exceeded 60% of their pre-war population, with major cities destroyed and industrial capacity reduced to primitive levels. By any historical standard, the human species had been effectively eliminated as a galactic threat. Their civilization lay in ruins. Their military had ceased to exist, and their surviving population lacked the resources to rebuild their former technological capabilities. But the humans refused to acknowledge defeat. Intelligence reports described survivors emerging from hidden shelters and immediately beginning reconstruction efforts focused not on civilian infrastructure, but on military preparation for the next war. They were studying imperial tactics, analyzing the weaknesses revealed during 3 years of occupation, and developing new strategies based on lessons learned from their own defeat. Captain Torres stood on the observation deck of his transport ship, watching the last Imperial vessels leave Earth's orbit. Below, the blue-green world showed the scars of warfare, continent-sized burn marks where major cities had been reduced to glass, atmospheric disturbances from biological weapons, and the distinctive radiation signatures of human nuclear weapons, used in final desperate acts of resistance. Yet even as Imperial forces withdrew, human communications networks were already active again. Coded transmissions spread across the planet, coordinating reconstruction efforts and maintaining contact with resistance cells that had somehow survived 3 years of systematic extermination attempts. The humans were planning for the future, with the same determination they had shown while fighting for survival. The Imperial withdrawal from Sol system marked the first time in recorded history that the Empire had abandoned a conquest due to cost considerations rather than military defeat. The precedent sent shockwaves across Imperial territory as other conquered species realized that the seemingly invincible Empire could be forced to retreat by enemies willing to pay any price for freedom. Rebellion erupted across dozens of worlds, as populations that had been pacified for generations suddenly employed human-inspired tactics against their occupying forces. The Imperial military found itself fighting simultaneous uprisings that shared strategic coordination while maintaining tactical unpredictability, creating a military nightmare that stretched Imperial resources beyond their breaking point. Economic analysis revealed the true scope of human victory. The cost of suppressing human-inspired rebellions across Imperial territory exceeded the economic benefits of maintaining the Empire's expanded borders. For the first time in Imperial history, conquest had become economically impossible rather than simply militarily challenging. The humans had redefined victory itself. While traditional warfare focused on destroying enemy military capabilities and seizing territorial objectives, human strategic doctrine treated survival as success and continued resistance as victory. They had demonstrated that a technologically inferior enemy could defeat a superior force by refusing to accept defeat and maintaining the will to resist regardless of casualties or material losses. Intelligence officers struggled to understand human decision-making processes that operated by rules completely different from any known species. These beings had chosen to sacrifice their entire civilization to prove that the Empire could be resisted. They had paid the ultimate price to teach the galaxy that freedom was possible, and their example had inspired resistance movements that would threaten Imperial stability for generations. Admiral Thane recorded his final log entry as the Imperial fleet left the Sol system behind. The official records would describe the campaign as a successful punitive expedition that had eliminated a potential threat to Imperial security. Unofficial reports would tell a different story, the account of how a primitive species had defeated the galaxy's most powerful military force by refusing to lose. The humans had lost everything but somehow won everything. Their homeworld lay in ruins, their population decimated, their technological civilization destroyed. But they had accomplished something no other species in galactic history had achieved. They had forced the Empire to retreat, not because of military defeat, but because the cost of victory exceeded the Empire's ability to pay it. As the last Imperial transport cleared Earth's orbital space, human survivors began emerging from their shelters to survey the devastation. They had paid the ultimate price for their resistance, losing more than half their people and reducing their world to a shadow of its former glory. But they had gained something invaluable in return: proof that the Empire could be defeated by any species with the will to resist and the determination to pay any price for freedom. The galaxy would never be the same. Other species had learned that technological superiority could be overcome by strategic thinking, popular determination, and the uniquely human concept that death was preferable to surrender. The human way of war had become the new paradigm for galactic resistance, and the Empire that had seemed invincible now faced an uncertain future in a galaxy that had learned to fight back. In hidden bunkers beneath the ruins of their cities, human survivors planned for the future with the same determination that had carried them through 3 years of hopeless warfare. They had lost the battle for their world, but won the war for galactic freedom, teaching every species in the galaxy that victory belonged to those willing to pay any price for it. The Empire had departed, but the humans remained, and that was the only victory that truly mattered.